Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a full day of addressing the climate crisis through the practice of architecture. Katie, Dina, thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to take part in this climate symposium, especially in New York, my home state, an early adopter of low-carbon construction policies, which are now focusing on embodied carbon. Perhaps second only to California. California was the first state to initiate embodied carbon policy and legislation, the Buy Clean California Act back in 2017. New York State's Climate Act, which included emissions associated with manufacturing, cement, and the building sector, became law in 2019. Reducing the built environment's contribution to carbon emissions actually begins with raw material and manufacturing emissions. The Upfront embodied carbon. Many years ago, when I first started my engineering career, designing sensors for the Space Shuttle program and various defense projects, the phrase embodied carbon was not yet a part of the English lexicon. Yet today, it plays the pivotal role in sustainable design, a pivotal role in global warming. Embodied carbon and embodied emissions might be the most poorly named concepts in the global warming vocabulary. There is nothing embodied about embodied emissions. By the time we refer to them, they have already been released. They do not exist in the material or the product in question. This beautiful sky is what embodied emissions look like, residing in the atmosphere as atmospheric carbon, not visible to the eye. They will remain there for hundreds of years. But they are there, multiplying the greenhouse gas effect. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. Water vapor and stratiform clouds contribute nearly 3/4 of the heat re-radiation, 3/4 of the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide is just 20% of the greenhouse gas mix. Though only 20% of the mix, carbon dioxide's greenhousing effect controls 80% of the impact. Heat re-radiation from atmospheric CO2 increases air temperature, which in turn influences the air's moisture content. But unlike water vapor, CO2 neither condenses nor precipitates from the atmosphere. It stays there, re-radiating heat and enabling higher levels of water vapor, which do so as well. This nebulous thing called embodied carbon is one of the few warming accelerants that we can minimize within this decade, something that everyone in this room can do. What are embodied emissions? That depends on your perspective. To some, it's manufacturing emissions, the emissions associated with producing a product. That means from raw material mining through production and packaging and everything in between, from cradle to the shipping dock. To others, it includes transportation to the construction site, or maybe installation or maintenance, or repair or refurbishment, or disassembly and disposal, or preparation for eventual reuse. Is embodied carbon important? New York State's Climate Act thinks so. Named the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, it started New York's ball rolling. In 2021, New York State passed the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, a very long name. In 2022, the Climate Action Council released the Climate Act Scoping Plan, which includes market development and incentives for low embodied carbon products and construction. New York State Executive Order 22 and New York City Executive Order 23, both issued in 2022, they both address embodied carbon. The Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, put $4.5 billion on the table for low-carbon construction materials, perhaps because embodied emissions are immediate and unrecoverable. Between now and 2030, as much as 70% of carbon emissions attributed to new buildings will come from embodied carbon. Unfortunately, none of this has been promoted. With 2030 targets a mere 5 years away and a climate crisis brewing, minimizing emissions up front is crucial to the 1.5 degree target. Even though the AEC industry has worked diligently to obtain energy efficiencies, to employ energy modeling, electrification, and energy decarbonization, and to design more net zero buildings, we need to take stock of what we refer to as sustainable design, stock of its veracity regarding emissions, stock of reality. Building designs come to fruition within the architectural professions. Whether you are an architect or a designer or an engineer, a client or a builder, or part of the construction industry, be it a building or infrastructure, an interior, or the systems, fittings, or furnishings, your project's contribution to atmospheric carbon begins with embodied carbon, upfront embodied emissions. Whether by design, by specification, or procurement, every element of the construction process arrives with a prior release of embodied emissions. So how are we doing? Are we minimizing greenhouse gas emissions in a timely manner? Does our progress reflect building design? Or is it coming from equipment and appliance efficiencies? Or is it primarily from energy decarbonization? Is our current approach to sustainable design enough to thwart global warming? I've spent more than a decade investigating the built environment's impact on our surroundings. The last 6 years exclusively on embodied carbon's role in global warming. So much time that my wife, who's an urban planner in New York City, forbade me to mention embodied carbon or even EPDs during mealtimes. Truth be told, preferably not at all. Well, I'm sorry, Paula, even though you're not here, but today there were 6 AIA learning units. So without apologies, let's begin. There's this thing. There we go. Let's turn the calendar back to 2018, a year that set the stage for New York State's Climate Act, as well as New York City's Local Law 97, both becoming law in 2019. I was researching Thwart Climate Change Now at the time, my book about embodied carbon. That December, one of Coates' 10,000 members, I received an email, a post to Coates' website. I remember it to this day. It began, quote, "Happy holiday. This is big." It explained that amid sobering projections about climate change, there was some upbeat news to share. Quote, "Our hard work is having a big impact," it said. Our hard work caught my attention. The post stated that energy efficiency and power sector decarbonization have reduced U.S. building sector CO2 emissions by 20.2% below 2005 levels, and this was 2018. And this was despite adding approximately 30 billion square feet to our building stock. At first glance, I thought, wow, our work is having a big impact. Sustainable design must be working. But reading further, I realized this upbeat news, based on an Energy Information Administration report, was attributed primarily to energy efficiency. and to power sector decarbonization. So what part of that was due to our work to designing buildings? Parsing the data, the minutiae, was like opening Pandora's box. The 20% reduction was real, but had little to do with building design. The significant reductions came from replacing coal with natural gas, wind, and solar, and a notable reduction in the energy used for illumination, from compact fluorescent lighting, from the introduction of LEDs, which perhaps was the most significant contribution to lowering operating emissions since 2000. But there were other factors too. Energy demand had decreased due to mild weather and to poor economic conditions. One might say that emissions declined in spite of new building designs. But there is something else to note here. EIA's building sector only included emissions from the residential and commercial use sectors, and only their operating emissions, such as heating, lighting, air conditioning, and electricity consumption, not embodied emissions, the ones released up front, not from manufacturing the construction materials, nor the fittings, fixtures, and furnishings, nor manufacturing the building systems or appliances, nor from the transportation of any of these items, nor manufacturing the construction equipment or vehicles or operating them. In other words, due to how economic sectors were categorized, the magnitude of emissions attributed to buildings was significantly higher than reported. This is what I mean by taking stock of reality, the veracity of the claims, and the efficacy of our actions. Since 2018, our understanding of sustainable design has changed. We've learned that not all carbon emissions have the same impact on the rate of global warming, that upfront embodied emissions associated with the production of construction materials accelerate global warming. They add fuel to the fire. They play a defining role. Embodied carbon is the elephant in the room. Since 2018, we have built over 250,000 privately owned housing units in New York State. And that includes during the COVID shutdown. More than 1 million units in New York State since 2000. Last year, nearly 50,000 new building permits were issued in New York State for residential units alone. Here we are closing in on 2025. Everyone is reporting about 2024's record-breaking heat. July was the 14th consecutive month of record-high global temperatures. No one talks about the record-breaking level of the atmospheric carbon that causes them. We are still being fed green platitudes and pats on the back and regurgitated statements based on a paucity of verified information. We are still talking about policy, about data collection, and mandates, not action. But action is possible by everyone in this room. According to the hidden climate impact of residential construction, a recent report by RMI, cradle-to-grave embodied emissions from new home construction could exceed 50 million tons of CO2 equivalent gases annually. This is just for U.S. residential construction. According to the study, up to half of those embodied emissions can be eliminated with commercially available, affordable, and code-compliant building materials. As much as 75% reductions are possible with one-to-one material substitutions. Reductions like this are available in all phases of construction, and all of this starts with an architectural design. The power to reduce those emissions resides with all of you. It simply requires your sensitivity to embodied emissions, plus some creative thinking. In other words, relating spatial, structural, and envelope design to material selection while cognizant of embodied carbon. The same is true for fittings, fixtures, and furnishings. We need to realize that sustainable design commences with low carbon construction. Some of you might ask, with wind and solar and electrification on the rise, why this sudden emphasis on upfront emissions? To answer that question, let's cut to the chase. Let's connect a few dots. Let's look at carbon emissions and the warming timeline. The blue line here traces the increasing concentration of atmospheric carbon in ppm, parts per million, from pre-industrial through 2023. In 1910, for the first time in over 300,000 years, the concentration of atmospheric carbon exceeded 300 parts per million. A new daily record exceeding 428 parts per million was reached on April 26th of this year. An increase of 128 parts per million over 113 years. The rate of increase since March 2000 is double that, 58 parts per million in only 24 years, 53% higher than the prior 24 years. Unfortunately, atmospheric carbon is the factor that induces global warming. For the 2,000 years prior to 1900, the average temperature stayed within plus or minus 1/4 of a degree Celsius. Since the early 1900s, it has increased more than 1.3 degrees Celsius, and that's the red line on this chart. According to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2023 was the warmest year since global records began in 1850. The average global surface temperature for 2023 was 1.35 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average, the Paris Agreement baseline. I created this graph in March for a keynote at LA's COAT Symposium in April. This is what it looks like now, updated through this August. A bit shocking. The average for the 12 months through this August was even higher, 1.49 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. We've continued to break global temperature records each month. These increases were driven by the increasing concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Temperature increases are nearly linear now with the increase in atmospheric carbon. The concentration of atmospheric carbon is driven by carbon dioxide emissions released from fossil fuels and industrial production. That's the black line on this graph, in billions of metric tons per year, gigatons. The red circle reveals the reduction in annual emissions in 2020 due to the COVID shutdown. The COVID dip in the black line here is considerable, a reduction of more than 2 billion tons of carbon emissions for that 1 year. But notice the blue line, the level of atmospheric CO2. It continues to climb. Why? Because CO2 emissions remain in the atmosphere. They are not reduced as emissions decrease. New emissions are additive. They will remain in the atmosphere for centuries. To flatten the growth rate of atmospheric carbon, we must reduce emissions now, annually. Unfortunately, as you can see from this graph, annual emissions, the black line, have already returned to their pre-COVID level and continue to increase. And unfortunately, though we are well on the way to decarbonize our energy supply, demand for energy is also increasing. worldwide, increasing faster than decarbonization with no net gain. This drill on climate science is to make a single point: the urgency of tackling upfront emissions. What we spew into the atmosphere today and tomorrow will increase global warming immediately. This is why upfront embodied emissions are so egregious. Waiting for the 2030s or for future decarbonization to start flattening the curve is wishful thinking. Regardless of all the green certifications, fawning articles in the press, and competition award winners, we are not doing enough. It comes down to efficacy, the effectiveness of our attempt to design sustainably. Excess embodied emissions are not a necessary fact of life. They are designed in by structural, material, and aesthetic decisions, some even in the name of sustainability. To provide a little context for today's symposium, let's focus on a few building designs, ones that highlight what I'm talking about: embodied carbon, the upfront kind. This is the new design studio at the University of Miami's School of Architecture, completed in 2018 and LEED certified. The 20,000 square foot roof with its 5,000 square foot overhang was constructed from reinforced concrete. Embodied emissions estimate at more than 100 metric tons of CO2, in addition to those from the building's concrete walls. We all know that cement is responsible for 8% of the world's energy-related CO2 emissions. I hope architecture students learn that as well. It's not that cement concrete was used, but rather the overabundance, the quantity. What were they thinking? Should this be a model for architecture students to emulate? This 62-story residential high-rise in Miami was completed in 2019. The exoskeleton was clad with 4,800 precast glass fiber reinforced concrete panels, weighing a ton or more each. They were shipped from Dubai, 9,000 nautical miles in dozens of trips. CO2 emissions from concrete cladding might be deemed excessive by itself. But shipping from Dubai to Miami, emitting hundreds of thousands of kilograms of additional CO2 emissions, on top of that, they were shipped with custom steel cradles for protection, adding significantly to that embodied carbon. What were they thinking? This beautifully conceived LEED silver project with geothermal wells for heating and cooling was completed in New Canaan, Connecticut in 2015. For part of the structure, they chose glulam beams, environmentally sustainable, a great carbon sequestering choice. But perhaps, I must add, the LEED certification for building design and construction noted the use of green building materials. But perhaps their point of origin was not part of the equation. The glulam beams were fabricated in Vancouver, British Columbia, the project about an hour south of here. Some beams were as long as 95 feet, unsuitable for transport on winding roads. They had to be trucked by a route around the Rockies from British Columbia almost to Mexico, then up and across the U.S. to Connecticut. Around 20 truckloads responsible perhaps for 250,000 kilograms of CO2 emissions. Even environmentally conscious design can be undone by transportation. Oh, how about those full-height glass panels? They were manufactured in Germany. Then they were shipped to Spain to be curved before coming to Connecticut. Sustainable design? What were they thinking? This computer science building at Cornell University, my alma mater, was finished in 2014, a glass-clad structure with steel sunscreen appendages to block heat-inducing sunlight. This is the north side of the building. According to Cornell's Sustainability Office, these angular sunshades contributed to the structure's LEED Gold certification. Nonetheless, the intense sunlight from the east and south necessitated additional interior pull-down screens to screen the exterior screens. And you can see that that's the photo on the right. Why one would design a computer lab with floor-to-ceiling windows that admit the sunlight and glare, I'll leave that to you. But it's hard to ignore addition of steel sunscreens on the north side of a building in the northern hemisphere. Steel emissions are in the same league as cement, responsible for about 8% of global energy-related emissions. Was this just for aesthetics in the name of sustainable design? What were they thinking? What about solar panels? Do rooftop solar installations generate enough energy to justify their embodied carbon footprint? Not this one in the Hudson Valley, shaded by trees. I hope none of you own this house. See. It may reduce the homeowner's electric bill, but this one is a net negative for carbon emissions, probably for its first decade of operation. And this is not uncommon. Here's another one in the Bronx with panels oriented to the north. Perhaps these residential examples were directed by the homeowner. This array, however, is attributed to architects. It's in New York City's Washington Square Park, amidst tall trees and tall buildings, installed in the name of sustainable design. What were they thinking? Not all rooftop solar installations justify their embodied footprint. Southern regions in the U.S. receive sufficient irradiance, but northern states have 10 to 25% lower solar exposure. With shade from buildings or trees or poor directional alignment, they will actually add to global warming for a long time. For all of these projects and numerous more like them, the answer to what they were thinking is simple. They were thinking about fluidity of design, in some cases perhaps sustainable design. You know, the thermal mass of concrete, carbon sequestering wood construction, the benefit of sunscreens, and why not add solar panels? But they weren't thinking about embodied carbon, about upfront emissions. So let's focus now on you, the professionals who design and construct our buildings and infrastructure. Let's borrow a phrase from our Department of Homeland Security. If you see something, say something as early in the design process as possible, before it gets baked in. Today's discussions will address strategies to minimize carbon emissions and to address their impacts. Please keep in mind that at every stage of design, we need to question its global warming potential, from conceptual to structural to envelope design to fittings and fixtures through material procurement. A few key factors that impact upfront emissions are a good place to start. Whether it's material selection or substitution, structural strategies, circularity or reuse, or material conservation, when embodied emissions are in mind, excess materials, poor choices, and transportation emissions become obvious. And your ability to predict the efficacy of your designs will rely on a few simple factors. First and foremost, how much of a product will you use? The second, what is the product's global warming potential? It's GWP. It's CO2 equivalent emissions per unit of use. And third, as I've demonstrated, where is it manufactured? GWP and point of manufacture can be found on a product's environmental product declaration. It's EPD if it has one. which brings us to the Achilles heel of low-carbon design, EPDs. Addressing a materials abundance or use of long-distance shipping is obvious, but trying to compare the emissions from one design scheme to another with EPDs, or comparing one vendor's products to another's, is something else. How many of you have actually used EPDs? Show of hands. 2. Okay. Well, maybe I caught you in time here because I'm going to tell you a few things about them. If you've tried but couldn't find many, you're in a majority. Nonetheless, they will become obligatory. How many of you are familiar with New York State Executive Order 22? Again, only a few. It covers new construction, 5,000 square feet or more, or significant renovations for New York State agencies or departments under the governor's authority, which includes universities. The exception is the Port Authority. Permitting requires that design teams calculate total embodied carbon, including from shipping and for transportation and construction equipment. Bidders are required to submit EPDs when available for covered products. Executive Order 22 has been in effect since January 2023. New York City followed in similar fashion with Executive Order 23, requiring submission of EPDs for concrete and steel to Building Transparency's database. EPDs are also required for IRA funding and Buy Clean programs. And this is only the beginning. To evaluate the global warming potential of any manufacturer's product for any of your projects, you must rely on its EPD. Unfortunately, the availability, reliability, and comparability of EPD data is severely lacking. Aside from ready-mix concrete, there is a paucity of EPDs to survey and little geographic distribution. For those that exist, there lacks a single rule set to support comparisons and certainty. EPDs must conform to what's called product category rules, PCRs. But multiple PCRs may be issued for a given product category by different groups of interested parties. And optional formats may be allowed by a single PCR. Here's an example. If you haven't ever used these, it may be a little confusing and it's probably hard to read. This declaration, these are first 2 pages from an EPD for ready-mix concrete from a plant in Westchester County, issued on August 8th, and it's valid for 5 years. It was created from the latest rule set, the PCR for concrete from NSF International of February 2024, version 2.3. The mix has a compressive strength of 3,000 psi at 28 days. It's important to note on page 2 that this EPD was calculated using manufacturer-specific cement data. And that's the way that it should be, which is detailed in the list of sources. This declaration is from another EPD for a 3,000 psi mix at 28 days from a different Westchester County concrete plant. It was created from the exact same PCR using the same third-party verifier and published within a day of the other EPD. Both of these are in Building Transparency's database, the one required by New York City. Yet they differ in their disclosure certainty. This one comes with a huge caveat. While the prior one was computed using manufacturer-specific cement data, this one used industry average data provided by the Portland Concrete Association. As such, the GWP value declared on page 1 is modified by a caveat, a disclaimer, on page 2. It states that the manufacturer-specific cement impacts could result in variation of as much as 37%. That's because they didn't use manufacturer-specific cement data in this EPD. In other words, the GWP declared on page 1, the 254 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per batch, might be inaccurate by 37%. In fact, they don't tell you whether that's plus or minus. A caveat like this renders this EPD meaningless. You wouldn't know that if you just took the data from the database, unless you actually printed out the EPD itself and read all the fine print. Fortunately, with the recent scrutiny of ByClean programs, more EPDs now use manufacturer-specific values, but nonetheless, New York State has a long way to go. Close to 80% of New York State plants that entered or updated EPDs in Building Transparency's database in the last 6 months through September submitted EPDs with this kind of caveat. And keep in mind, nothing requires EPDs to be comparable from manufacturer to manufacturer, even from different plants of a single supplier. The EPA is working to change that by developing a registry for low-carbon construction materials that meet IRA standards and to make them accessible online. Hopefully these programs will be viable, but they will take years to facilitate and to gain traction. So until a sufficient supply of standardized EPDs are widely available, what can you do in the meantime to cut upfront emissions? How does one attack this problem? The answer is by focusing on what you can control. There are 3 phases to the accrual of embodied emissions in a product's life cycle. The first phase, from raw materials to installation, is known as the A block. Then comes the use period, the B block, maintenance, repair, and replacement. Finally, the C block, end-of-life emissions, deconstruction, transport, waste processing, and disposal. If circularity is part of the discussion, there is a 4th phase, the D block, recovery and reuse. All of these are important, but our immediate goal is to reduce upfront emissions. That's the A block. What occurs past the A block, past installation, is speculative. More speculative the further out you go. Speculative about use, maintenance, repair, and replacement, especially about a building's lifetime, or whether components will be recycled or reused, or whether embodied carbon will even matter then 40 years from now should zero carbon energy dominate the grid. To some extent, full life cycle modeling may be spinning wheels for at least now. Life cycle A block emissions are tangible, controllable in real time by your design and procurement decisions. Focus on your A block decision making. What about circularity, the potential for reuse? Am I saying don't bother? Absolutely not. Circularity is extremely important for many reasons, even if a particular component is never reused. Designing for ease of disassembly or reprocessing is a carbon benefit, and it may be designed to minimize waste, pollution, and landfill, all environmentally beneficial. Nonetheless, having low upfront emissions is critical for circular products too. Modeling is crucial to sound design decision making, from structure and envelope to environmental control systems, and a host of other parameters. How do we handle the EPD problem? Modeling and detailing are at different ends of the spectrum. That's if you model to design rather than model what you've already built. Industry or manufacturer average EPDs or database averages are sufficient for modeling design schema comparisons. whether for the structure, envelope, or interior. A GWP estimate for modeling can be determined from most EPDs, even for those which may seem somewhat misleading. Just be sure to factor in the caveat. Comparing design approaches can be accomplished with generic information, but detailing is another matter. Ultimately, success or failure of a low-carbon project will be cast by the structural and aesthetic decisions carried out through detailing and locked in by a spec writer. And that's when emissions comparisons become critical, ultimately relying on the veracity of specific EPDs. Until we have a sufficient supply of EPDs and widespread comparability, low-carbon design will rely on your creativity and your skill sets, your design and material choices. So I will close with a few rules of thumb and a few thoughts that can help. Rule number one is the easiest way to cut embodied carbon. It's a throwback to Mies, less is more. No matter what material you select, less of it is more climate friendly. Embodied emissions come by the pound or kilogram, or by the unit or square foot. For example, a 50-pound bag of cement already emitted about 40 to 45 pounds of carbon dioxide during production. Of course, material reuse or circularity, or increasing a building's lifespan by renovation or adaptive reuse, serves this credo as well. Rule number two, be cautious with products processed at high temperature. Firing ceramic, porcelain, and brick, sometimes multiple times, for surface effects, to create color, or a shade of black, or for glazing, adds emissions. Thanks to this helpful disclosure from a brickmaker's EPD, one can see the emissions impact of an aesthetic choice. There is a 21% spread in upfront embodied emissions from color groups 1 through 10 of this particular manufacturer's bricks. Your choices matter. Rule of thumb number 3. Check a product's material content. You can't tell a book by its cover. Many construction products are composites of materials, such as for roofing and siding. The principle of mass applies here too, the mass of high GWP constituents. Of course, whatever the product, let's not forget transportation emissions to the construction site. But if you can only handle one of the above, make it rule number 1, use less. At COP28 last November, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres noted, it's minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit, but it's not too late. He was referring to the temperature increase above the Paris Agreement pre-industrial baseline. How close are we? What is the urgency? That relates to where you get your information and to your attention to the details. If you read the Wall Street Journal on September 24th, this front page graph implied we are roughly at 1.25 degrees centigrade, well below the 1.5 degree target. But looking at the details, the temperature increases plotted relate to the 1961 to 1990 average temperature, not to pre-industrial. I have no idea what the purpose of this was, but that was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. If you looked at NOAA's website for the 12-month period ending this August, 1.32 degrees C was reported. But that was above the 20th century mean, not pre-industrial. When that is adjusted to the Paris Agreement baseline, the result is an increase of 1.49 degrees Celsius, so basically 1.5. And that was for the last 12 months. If you look at the EU's Copernicus Climate Service, which you don't see very much here, it was reported that global surface temperatures had reached or exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial for 12 consecutive months. So we have choices. We can ignore the details, comforted by our faith in the press, and we can install green appendages to please a client or as a feel-good green. Or we can meet the letter of new building codes and new climate regulations rather than the spirit. But none of this will reduce carbon emissions soon enough to make a difference. We must take it upon ourselves to act. I came across an excellent report that might help, published by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Net zero buildings halving construction emissions today. The report provides excellent strategies to reduce embodied carbon. It's available for free download at wbcsd.org. I highly recommend it. For a more complete picture of the mindset we need going forward and how our love affair with all things green and sustainable got us here, my book might help. Thwart Climate Change Now, Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick. I wrote it to be a solutions-oriented eye-opener. It comes down to our creativity, to our personal decisions. With approximately 120,000 registered architects in the U.S. alone, about 3.2 million estimated worldwide, we can make a huge difference. And that doesn't include interns or other design professionals and the rest of the AEC industry. This is an enormous amount of specification power, capable of minimizing upfront embodied emissions through low-carbon construction. Keep in mind that embodied emissions from construction materials are released years before a building is ever occupied, years before infrastructure is ever used. That is why your ability to cut upfront emissions through design and by material selection matters so much, why it is so important. And to quote a rapper, not that I follow rappers, but an activist, Robert Del Naja, was interviewed by the New York Times. He's working to create low emissions music festivals. He said, if it's not 1.5 compatible, it's irrelevant. Simply a gesture, an idea. It's not doing anything. So let's get to work and let's spread the word. And please don't forget, if you see something, say something. Thank you for listening.